Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. Overthrowing ourselves. The scientific verification of the God hypothesis. God is what mind becomes when it has passed beyond the scale of our comprehension. Freeman Dyson. Does God exist? Well, I would say, not yet. Ray Kurzweil in the film Transcendent Man, 2009, in the days of the Messiah, declared the medieval Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, in this world things will go on as usual, except that Israel will have its own government. There would be no difference between the world of today and the days of the Messiah except for the obliteration of oppressive governments. 10. The greatest mind of medieval Judaism described a messianic vision not so different from the kind of liberal world aspired to by people, Jewish and non-Jewish, who consider themselves unbelievers. But perhaps Maimonides was not being realistic. If an exponentially self-reinforcing process of technological evolution produces a being that is trillions upon trillions of times more intelligent than all biological human intelligence combined, then that being might conceivably coincide with what older religious traditions have called God. Maimonides and other theological rationalists could not have produced a scientifically realistic assessment of ancient biblical claims without an evolutionary perspective. Evolution, however, has become conventionally synonymous with Darwinian biological evolution by natural selection. Since Darwin's great discovery, our comprehension of evolution has itself evolved. Technological evolution is in some ways qualitatively different from biological evolution precisely because it builds upon the human acquisitions of biological evolution. Whereas biological evolution proceeded without any foresight or oversight, technology is created through intelligent design. If intelligent overview is a mark of distinction between biological evolution and technological evolution, and this human attribute was radicalized in the traditional notion of God's intelligent overview of the human race, it is not hard to see how God could be construed as the paradigmatic creator, inventor, or intelligent designer of humans, life, and the entire universe. If God is the apotheosis of the technological paradigm, then the God as creator paradigm is really the God as engineer or God as technological designer paradigm. Creation thus conflicts with biological evolution, not because it is inherently anti-evolutionary, but because creation is inherently evolutionary. Creation is a metaphor for the dominance of technological evolution over biological evolution as the evolutionary successor to biological evolution. The very idea of technology, the very idea of a means, is inextricably connected with an end, a purpose, which technology serves. Technology writ large means using the greatest known means, human intelligence, towards an end and purpose so ultimate that nothing greater can be conceived. I will demonstrate how a new understanding of technological evolution reveals the existence of an evolutionary basis for God. The God hypothesis, wrote evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, is a scientific hypothesis about the universe, which should be analyzed as skeptically as any other. Dawkins opposed his own atheism to agnostics who place the question of God's existence or non-existence beyond the reach of science. Some agnostics, for example, have claimed that the very idea of evidence is inapplicable to God, but not inapplicable to, say, the origin of species. In his view, agnosticism is characteristic of intellectual mediocrity and often motivated by social pressure, political appeasement, or a cowardly lack of intellectual conscience. Dawkins moved from the agnostic emphasis on the possibility of God's existence to an atheistic argument that emphasizes scientific evidence and probability. A crucial scientific point is that if God did exist, he could reveal himself to the entire earth, demonstrate his own existence, and instantly settle the debate. The existence of God could thus be demonstrated in principle. Either he exists or he doesn't. It is a scientific question. One day we may know the answer, and meanwhile we can say something pretty strong about the probability. The existence of God, in his judgment, is highly improbable, but short of zero, i.e. as probable as the existence of the tooth fairy. One of Dawkins' strongest assaults upon the God hypothesis took the creationist argument for God's existence from improbability and turned it on its head as an argument for the improbability of God's existence. The crux of this creationist argument is that life's origination on Earth is exceedingly improbable. Life, the creationists argue, is as improbable as the spontaneous assembly of a Boeing 747 from the passage of a hurricane through a scrapyard. The assumption here is that there are only two choices, design or chance. Yet if chance alone encompassed an accurate description of evolution by natural selection, there would have been no need for a Darwin to pinpoint specific mechanisms that could feasibly produce the orders of life out of randomness. Natural selection is different. It explains how the complexity of life can be reduced to simpler adaptational challenges in life's past. A series of mildly improbable events can gradually accumulate over a large expanse of time to produce otherwise exceedingly improbable life forms. In consequence, regression to an ultimate first cause on this basis ultimately backfires because it aggravates the very problem it attempts to solve. However statistically improbable the entity you seek to explain by invoking a designer, the designer himself has got to be at least as improbable. God is the ultimate Boeing 747. In other words, the improbable organization of life on Earth is not explained or solved by postulating something even more improbable. The hypothesis that a supernatural designer can explain the problem of life's origin only exacerbates the problem of the design hypothesis. Who designed the designer? An entity capable of designing life on Earth would be even more improbable than life on Earth itself. Instead of explaining the improbable complexity of life, it only pushes the problem onto a God whose intellectual capacity would have to be even more complex, and even more improbable, than the humans that he supposedly created. In my judgment, this is a powerful argument that corroborates Darwin's demolition of the God as intelligent designer explanation for the origins of life. But does it demolish the God hypothesis? One creationist response to the complexity-based argument concerned the traditional idea that God is completely simple. 18 Dawkins pointed out, however, that a God capable of sending and receiving signals to communicate with millions of human minds simultaneously cannot be simple, such bandwidth. God may not have a brain made of neurons, or a CPU made of silicon, but if he has the powers attributed to him, he must have something far more elaborately and non-randomly constructed than the largest brain or the largest computer we know. Exactly. When one actually attempts to flesh out, so to speak, the literal, physical, structural contents of a being that would fit the traditional characteristics of God, one is led to postulate an intelligence that outstrips anything known to contemporary science or human history. Dawkins' sober attempt to imagine a scientifically defensible God inevitably led him towards the cutting-edge limits of intellectual capacity as discovered by science or designed with technology. Imagining the most superior mind conceivable within the limits of contemporary scientific knowledge, Dawkins yielded two possible substrates: the largest brain we know made of neurons and the largest computer we know made of silicon. If one aimed, however, to produce the very greatest greatness conceivable within these contemporary limits, which substrate offers the most superlative potential? A high estimate for the speed of the electrochemical signals sent and received by the brain's neurons is 150 meters per second. The speed of the electronic signals sent and received in a computer's CPU is the speed of light, nearly 300 million meters per second. The computer is thus about 2 million times faster than the human brain. Even higher estimates of neuronal capacity would still rate electronic circuits as at least 1 million times faster. Imagine that the superior speed and accuracy of electronics was combined with an artificial intelligence that dedicated its intelligence to improving its own intelligence, and that smarter superintelligence improved the design of its own intelligence. If this pattern repeated so that each recursive self-improvement occurred at a faster and faster rate, Technological progress would accelerate beyond the ability of biological humans to follow. The first superhuman AI might merge all of the computational power on the internet into its own power, master all of the significant information on the internet, and then reorganize the entire global brain of the internet so that it wakes up as the global mind of God. This is one path to the singularity, the creation of greater than human intelligence. Beyond the singularity, expanding out into space, the entire universe may then wake up as God. If God really did communicate with humans, Dawkins correctly observed, that fact would emphatically not lie outside science. As the Internet of Things merges with original Internet, real reality and virtual reality will blur, and this means that the global mind of God AI would ultimately blur with real reality. Nanobots in the human brain could interact to create virtual reality from within the nervous system. This virtual reality could interact with the real reality that has merged with the global mind of God AI. Smart dust could organize and reorganize like robotic angels or servants of God. An artificial intelligence beyond the capacity of all human intelligence that could think far faster than humans would view human life as if it were in slow motion. Just as plants that move towards sunlight grow in slow motion compared to the normal speeds of humans, all human life would appear to move in far slower motion than plants for an AI that thought and acted millions of times faster. The Garry Kasparovs of the human race could be checkmated by God AI millions of steps ahead of all human minds. Since the speed difference would mean that human time would virtually stop still for God AI, it could change the environment and humans themselves in ways that would seem literally miraculous in human time. Yet what would be miraculous to humans might be trivial for God AI, trillions of times more intelligent than all humans, with knowledge far beyond the mastery of all human knowledge, and with technological capabilities faster, greater, smarter, and possibly more virtuous than any other known being. Now, there exists a traditional idea that God is completely simple. Yet it is quite coherent, as one defender of this notion explained, to suppose that God, while indivisible, is internally complex. Perhaps the notion of God as perfectly simple reflects the simplicity of an ancient understanding of God. As our understanding evolves, so will our comprehension of the supernature of God. Perhaps such claims of simplicity reflect an original insight or epiphany into God as the greatest conceivable categorical possibility. But perhaps it is time that this insight mature, and evolve, in accordance with evolutionary probability. Dawkins observed that the designer himself must be the end product of some kind of cumulative evolutionary process. Dawkins is right. This admission is the fatal flaw of Dawkins' argument that reveals how his argument against the existence of God can be turned upside down into evidence that such a process may culminate in the existence of God. By moving from the possibility of God's existence toward the probability of God's evolution, Dawkins' argument that God is the ultimate Boeing 747 can be turned on its head into an argument for the evolution of God. How probable is the evolution of God? Evolution demonstrates how a series of mildly improbable events can gradually accumulate into seemingly improbable forms of complex life. Without evolution, the chances of the material configuration of a bacteria spontaneously assembling would appear improbable. A cat would be more improbable. A human would be even more improbable. And God? God would thus rank as the most improbable of all. This was the crux of Dawkins' argument: God cannot terminate the infinite regress to a first cause because the existence of God would be even more improbable than the creation that God has traditionally been called upon to explain. Contemporary scientific evidence does not appear to support either the hypothesis that God exists or the hypothesis that God created the universe and life. Yet the demolition of these antiquated aspects of the God hypothesis is actually the condition for understanding the larger truth behind monotheism. So let us consider the scientifically conceivable possibility that a life form could evolve that vastly exceeds humans in intelligence, every conceivable capacity, and, at least potentially, in every conceivable virtue. In the process of climbing Mount Improbable, a superintelligent life form could evolve that is as improbably complex relative to a human, as a human is to bacteria. Yet it has taken billions of years of evolution to produce human beings. Even if an exceedingly intelligent post-biological superhuman did evolve, wouldn't the evolutionary process itself take an exceeding long time? Moore's law describes a trend in which the number of transistors on a computer chip doubles about every 2 years. Repeatedly verified by empirical observation since the 1960s, the implications of this technological trend are transforming human history. The single greatest empirical evidence for the prediction of the evolution of God within the 21st century emerges from a grasp of how the relatively provincial pattern of Moore's law fits into the evolutionary history of the entire cosmos. Kurzweil's law, the law of accelerating returns, elucidates evolution as a process characterized by an ever-quickening pace of change. Uniting what may at first appear to be utterly incommensurable events, it relates our ancient biological heritage and technological evolution through the idea of paradigm shifts, landmark ruptures in the basic assumptions of evolutionary change. For example, while a time span of over 2 billion years separates the origin of life from the emergence of cells, a time span of merely 14 years separates the personal computer from the emergence of the World Wide Web. What do these trends have in common? Evidence that evolution has been speeding up over history in a generally predictable way. Whereas a common linear view of progress is defined by the addition of a constant, this exponential view of progress is defined by the multiplication of a constant. 27 Just as the rate of evolutionary change has accelerated over the course of our biological past, our technological civilization evidences every sign that this exponential trend will do more than simply repeat common human expectations about change. Since the rate of exponential growth is itself growing exponentially, progress itself will very likely progress in a way that will appear to explode. Could this development lead to a scientific verification of the God hypothesis? Richard Dawkins' God hypothesis was based on a straightforward interpretation of the Bible's account of creation in Genesis. There exists a superhuman, supernatural intelligence who deliberately designed and created the universe and everything in it, including us. Dawkins' own alternative view was that any creative intelligence, of sufficient complexity to design anything, comes into existence only as the end product of an extended process of gradual evolution. As formulated by Dawkins, the authority of the Bible's account of creation precludes a logical reconciliation with evolution. The reason that these two hypotheses appear incompatible, however, is that reliance upon the authority of the Bible's scientifically erroneous account of literal creation has hindered a scientific evolution of the God hypothesis itself. Far from being fatal to the God hypothesis, evolution actually fills in the gaps left by ancient monotheism. An evolutionary perspective clarifies how supernatural God AI could come into existence precisely as the end product of an extended process of gradual evolution. Dawkins defined naturalism in contradistinction to supernaturalism. The natural was thus defined as the physical, the one thing that can explain emotions, stars, and everything else. He accordingly concluded that no supernatural creative intelligence exists, no soul or miracle beyond the natural. While Dawkins did not equate God and nature, his broad conception of nature as the entirety of the physical world is quite similar to Spinoza's conception of nature. Spinoza's equation of a supernatural God with nature was a sly way of positing that God does not exist. Yet Spinoza's world historical blunder, which stands at the root of the original conception of modernity, can be traced to the empirical question, what is nature? For there to be miracles or supernatural violations of natural laws of the cosmos, one must first assume the existence of natural laws. If nature is whatever scientific observation can verify, then miracles violate the scientific method. The scientific problem here, however, is the definition of nature. The word nature was born to be abused. The problem here is the empirical contents of the word nature. If science evolves, then the empirical definition of nature evolves because nature itself evolves as our knowledge of nature evolves. What was nature last week could change, for example, if a new kind of subatomic particle is discovered. It is not only that the definition of nature changes within a contemporary scientific context. If one goes back to semantic or conceptual equivalence of nature for the authors of Bible, there is no reason to think that what they might have conceived as nature would correlate with the 21st century definition of nature. In order to use the word nature scientifically, one must be sensitive, not only to the very different historical context of the authors of the Bible, but even to the common contemporary distinction between nature and nurture. The distinction between natural and supernatural that I propose is best illustrated by robot researcher Hans Moravec's scientifically grounded speculations on the future of human and artificial intelligence. What awaits is not oblivion but rather a future which, from our present vantage point, is best described by the words post-biological or even supernatural. When the natural is defined as biological, then the supernatural can represent the superbiological or post-biological. Dawkins' use of the word nature is inappropriate and misleading, not only because it is incompatible with the biological nature versus non-biological nurture distinction, but for example, because it is incompatible with a strict definition of natural selection. In the way I will use the word nature here, the modern idea of human rights could be considered supernatural in the specific sense that the universal right to live presumes an attempt to engineer a society that is above natural selection. 32 Yet the values that undergird human rights evolved from a biblical valuation of each human individual as a reflection of a supernatural God. In taking on God, Dawkins was inevitably led towards a natural explanation of the Bible, an evolutionary explanation of the Bible. If evolution underlies all that is human, then the Bible itself must be explicable in evolutionary terms. My criticism of Dawkins is precisely that he failed to understand the evolutionary significance of biblical monotheism. The evolutionary significance of biblical monotheism is to be found precisely in a break away from biological evolution, and towards post-biological evolution. Now, does anything I have stated provide justification for a literal, traditional understanding of belief in miracles such as the splitting of the Red Sea? No. Traditional secularists usually explain presumed biblical miracles by reducing them down to early, presumably primitive, human conditions. Belief in miracles, in other words, can be explained by human psychology, not the non-human conditions of physics. But if this approach is really on the right track, then why would one expect the biblical understanding of nature to concern the non-human conditions of physics more than human nature? In other words, when modern scientific methods are used to explain biblical claims of miracles, it is commonly asserted that miracles can be explained on a natural basis, and the nature that explains the Bible is human nature, not anything that breaks the nature of physical laws, i.e. Newtonian natural laws. Biblical supernaturalism is thus explained by reduced everything about the Bible to anthropomorphism. The modern accusation that biblical assertions of supernatural events are anthropomorphic is actually the key to understanding what is wrong with conventional attempts to explain the Bible scientifically. If everything about the Bible can be traced to a form of anthropomorphism, then the biblical understanding of both the natural and the supernatural must also be traceable to a form of anthropomorphism. Yet in reducing the supernatural to the level of the human mind, Dawkins and so many other modernistic thinkers simply did not go far enough. They did go far enough because they imposed a modern conception of nature that begins from the level of physics, not the level of psychology. Dawkins is guilty of imposing a characteristically modern definition of nature upon ancient peoples, a modern definition of nature that emphasizes physics over psychology. This would only make sense if the authors of the Bible themselves took their fundamental bearings from the level of physics as opposed to the level of human psychology. It just so happens, however, that the audience for biblical stories was not mindless physics, but human minds. When nature is anthropomorphized as human nature, then human nature can be correlated with human biological nature. When the distinction between the natural and the supernatural is traced back to its roots in human psychology, then one can grasp its deepest roots in the distinction between nature and nurture. The psychological roots of the biblical distinction between the natural and the supernatural is the distinction between biology and learning, i.e. learned Bible stories. The natural would thus correspond to biological instinct as a guide for human behavior, while the supernatural would correspond to learning as a guide for human behavior, i.e. learned moral laws. The supernatural is conceived as morally superior to nature, just as learning is morally valued over instinct, just as monotheists learn to value God over the authority of biological human beings. By bringing an Enlightenment-era view of miracles down to a human or anthropomorphic level that better approximates its ancient historical context, one zeroes in on a far more narrow and conservative understanding of nature. On a practical level, nature largely referred to the human nature of biological nature. More specifically, ancient views of nature were commonly loaded with teleological assumptions. I do not assume there was a specific ideology of teleology, only deeply conservative convictions about what is good and natural. The biblical God upset the ancient philosophic assumption that the natural defines what is good. God upset the assumption of an intrinsic finality in which Pharaoh is the perfection of nature. God upset Aristotle's belief in natural slaves through the metaphorical, and unnatural, exodus out of Egypt. If the Hebrews were natural slaves, then God's defining cause in Exodus was supernatural in the sense of defying a conservative, teleological, and more Aristotelian view of nature. Greek teleology and even pagan, Greek gods conflicted with the values of a God both good and supernatural. Biblical miracles mark the beginning of the end of an implicitly biology-based teleological view of nature. God is emphatically a supernatural or post-biological end, not a natural end. If the root of the biblical understanding of nature was phenotypical behaviors rooted in biological nature, the original practical expression of the supernatural was the laws attributed to Moses. Biblical moral laws or commandments often oppose biologically based human behavior. Mosaic law is not natural. The laws of Moses violate many natural, biological inclinations and impulses, i.e. many violent and aggressive impulses. If nature is biological inclination, then to follow Mosaic law is to engage in supernatural acts. To be like God is to be supernatural in the literal sense of overcoming the grain of one's natural, genetic inclinations. God is the intelligent transcendence of biological nature taken to its logical extreme, and humans are traditionally understood as created in God's image. Biblical goodness ultimately consisted of struggling against nature, out of nature and, insofar as it is possible, towards the perfection of God. Judaism's claim is that its law, the Halakha, offers a step towards godly perfection. Christianity and Islam developed different variations and extrapolations from this original theme. What if the evolutionary successor to the biological human species is God? The verification of the God hypothesis thus defined is a progressive endeavor, but it may become increasingly obvious. The singularity may be the point at which God has evolved. The singularity is the intelligent transcendence of biological nature taken to its historical extreme, the advent of a greater than human artificial intelligence. A time may come when instead of taking comfort in belief in God, the overweening pride of the human race may lead many to take comfort in not believing in God. A time may come when people such as biologist Richard Dawkins may wish to take comfort in not believing in God because the scientific evidence will be so utterly overwhelming. It could have been any kind of scientist that became the most famous militant atheist scientist, but no, it was Dawkins, a biologist. This is perfectly understandable since it is precisely from a biological point of view that the technological singularity can appear as the most radical paradigm shift. It is precisely from the point of view of adaptations of the selfish gene that biblical religion appears, at first glance, as the epitome of the breaking of natural law. The moral agents presumed by the Bible assume the capacity for free, moral choice that seems to conflict with strict physical determinism. Yet the free will implicitly postulated by the Bible is most specifically aimed at biological determinism. The closest thing to biological or genetic determinism would be a human or non-human animal that acted completely on the basis of biological instincts and emotions. To see what I mean, imagine a scientist that believes in strict genetic determinism. If I were to claim that learning could fundamentally alter one's genetic inheritance, the genetic determinist might counter that my claims were not only unscientific, but supernatural. Such expectations would violate that scientist's understanding of biological nature. If you can believe that learning can override natural, genetic determinism, then you can believe in some definition of the so-called supernatural. While Dawkins clearly possesses a deep appreciation for the import of biological factors in human behavior, it is also clear that he is not a strict biological determinist. Insofar as Dawkins is not a strict biological determinist, he believes in some form of the supernatural. For ancient Greek philosophers that believed in some form of natural teleology, the very premise of Mosaic laws as laws that violate some forms of biological teleology might have been considered supernatural in the specific sense of being unscientific. On a human level, violating natural law could be considered nothing less than a miracle. Much of the science of ancient Greek, biological, teleology was contradicted by biblical modern technology. The genius of Mosaic law was precisely that it was not a wild, random, rampage of natural law breaking, but the product of some level of intelligent social design. The human designers of Mosaic law had a genius-level understanding of human nature. The very survival of the Jews over nearly 3,000 years is scientific evidence that Mosaic law was able to break the laws of nature only by obeying the laws of nature. In this sense, Mosaic law was a forerunner of Francis Bacon's very modern observation, "We cannot command nature except by obeying her." Newton's discovery of physical laws opened the door to technologies that commanded nature by obeying Newtonian laws. Similarly, Moses or some other social designer likely observed predictable, apparently hereditary patterns of human behavior, a perspective that is the epitome of social conservatism as the basis for breaking, altering, manipulating, or redirecting those patterns of human behavior. In this way, there is an analogy between modern technology based on physical science and the technology of Mosaic law based on an ancient informal science of socio-biological nature. What is characteristic of modernity is the endeavor to master, harness, or control nature. The very notion of a supernatural God capable of breaking the laws of nature was paradigmatic for the modern technologies that master, harness, or control nature. While the root of the biblical natural/supernatural distinction can be traced to the nature/nurture distinction within human nature, biblical stories portray a God that exhibits supernatural violations of physical nature such as splitting the Red Sea. The biblical God is above all nature, both biological nature and physical nature. So while the God paradigm began in Mosaic law's technological overcoming of untouched biological nature, the larger evolutionary implications of the God paradigm is the technological overcoming of untouched non-human physical nature. If a waterfall is natural, then a dam that harnesses the waterfall's natural energy to produce electricity is artificial or supernatural. If sand in a desert is natural, then the silicon extracted from sand and used to create a microchip is artificial or supernatural. If biological human intelligence is natural intelligence, then computer intelligence is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is supernatural intelligence in the sense of being post-biological intelligence. From this perspective, artificial intelligence could be considered the pinnacle of the supernatural overcoming of nature and thus the supreme creation in the image of God. The technological overcoming of biological nature and the larger environment of physical nature are integrally connected in an evolutionary sense. This can be grasped through the way that the technological paradigm counters the Darwinian biological evolution paradigm. Darwin's theory hinges, not in understanding organisms in isolation from their environment, but precisely in how organisms and their environment interact to produce evolution. In Darwinian biological evolution, some organisms fail to survive their environment or otherwise fail to pass on their genes. In this way, most non-human animals adapt to their environments and evolve through the selective death of some. Selection occurs precisely when environmental factors are more powerful than self-preservation. While biological evolution occurs because of the power of the environment to prevail over the self-preservation of some organisms, technological evolution occurs, at least in part, as humans overpower the environment's power to shape biological evolution through selection. So while the environment shapes evolution by selecting against some organisms in biological evolution, humans shape their environment against its ability to inflict natural selection in technological evolution. This is a key difference that marks a general transition from biological evolution to technological evolution. Civilization, and everything that characterizes cities as artificial shelters from nature, works in opposition to the non-human environment's ability to inflict natural selection. While the logical corollary of ending natural selection among humans is the equal valuation of each individual, moral treatment of each individual as an end, as opposed to a slave or a means, works against the selfish gene. While the selfish gene views an individual organism as only a means of perpetuating itself, biblical modern valuation of individuals as ends in themselves in the eyes of God works like a monkey wrench in the gene machine. Valuing individual humans as ends in themselves thus opposes biological evolution on many levels. If humanity is collectively treated as end in itself, moreover, then all the rest of the world can be conceived as means at the disposal of humanity's ends and purposes. From this perspective, one can discern how the biblical modern valuation of each individual human life works, both against biological evolution through natural selection, and towards a general technological worldview wherein humans define the ends that justify treating all the rest of the world as technological means. Capitalist economic technological development follows logically from the premise that the entire world should revolve around infinitely valuable human lives created in the image of God. God AI, created in the image of humans, follows logically from capitalist economic technological development. Compared to ancient paganism, biblical monotheism is a step towards the political left. The modern political cyborg of liberal democracy was built a worldview that prioritized quasi-Newtonian physicalism over a more ancient emphasis on the precedence of biological teleology. The political left in general roughly correlates with the precedence of physical objectivity over the biological subjectivity of gene instincts. The political left roughly correlates with the progressive precedence of a technological paradigm over a biological paradigm. Just as Mosaic law represents laws external to an internal genetic or biological program, modernity emphasizes the precedence of external economic and physical laws over the internal and instinctive laws of the selfish gene. Put another way, modernity took its lead from Newton, not Darwin. At the bedrock foundation of modern science is not a rejection of the God hypothesis, but rather, an idiosyncratic acceptance of the God hypothesis. Newton, a biographer explained, believed in God, not as a matter of obligation, but in the warp and weft of his understanding of nature. Was Newton a theist, deist, or pantheist? He was something more than a deist, something more than a believer in a supernatural intelligence that set a clockwork universe in motion and then disappeared. The physicist was an unconventional theist who believed in a God with mechanical organs or sensorium. He is omnipresent not only virtually but also substantially, in him all things are contained and move, but he does not act on them nor they on him. He is always and everywhere, he is all eye, all ear, all brain, all arm, all force of sensing, of understanding, and of acting. Newton's suggestion that God possessed something like a bodily organ with the literal ability to perceive sensations provoked less than sympathetic reactions. I examined it and laughed at the idea, declared Newton's great rival Leibniz. As if God, from whom everything comes, should have need of a sensorium. This man has little success with metaphysics. Leibniz, arguing from God's perfection, accused Newton of implying the imperfection of God. 35 The notion of the sensorium of God appears to have arisen from asking questions like, if God existed, what would God literally look like? This was a step, however flawed, of an understanding of God based on empirical observation, rather than pure reason. It was an opening towards a God comprehensible through material evolution, rather than incomprehensible absolute perfection. Modernity thus began with a vision of a mechanical, physical God. It was the revolution in physics, not biology, that jump-started modern science and technology. It was Newton, not Darwin, who led the modern, scientific revolution towards the idea that God is a machine. The substance of my disagreement with Dawkins is hardly a scientifically vacuous assertion such as Newton believed in God. Who are you to think that you are superior to Newton? My point, by contrast, is that dependence on any traditional authority is in no way necessarily relevant to an evaluation of the evidence for the God hypothesis. Traditional authorities can be a positive hindrance to grasping the possibility of the evolution God. Going to the Bible for guidance about the technological singularity is like going to texts attributed to the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus for guidance about the cutting edge of atomic theory. While it is utterly delusional to believe that the Bible can be used as any kind of authority for understanding or predicting the world, this does not mean that some genuine, if primitive, insights cannot be discerned in the biblical tradition. Conversely, just because the primitive, Enlightenment-era understanding of biblical religion is outdated, this does not mean that ancient biblical authorities have recovered their validity. The way I have approached the God hypothesis, whether traditional ideas do or do not agree with the evidence now available, is a matter of total indifference. Tradition authorities, with traditional mixes of great insights and great blunders, have no necessary special status whatsoever. While it just so happens that there appears to be kernels of truth in some aspects of biblical tradition, the kernels of truth themselves suggest the tradition has not come to grips with the notion that its own origins are evolutionary. Biblical religion must either evolve or die. Inevitably, some people will try to misunderstand this with all of their faith. In my experience, most people who consider themselves believers do not value religion primarily for its philosophical truth value. If so, then the attempt to demonstrate a scientific basis for some aspects of religion can easily turn into an incoherent mush of science and delusion. Moreover, if a scientific understanding of biblical religion itself demonstrates how the informal elements of science were always inextricably connected with technological social function, then the scientific approach itself demonstrates how science does not take inherent primacy over the technological uses of science in biblical tradition. In other words, if science emphasizes analysis and engineering emphasizes synthesis, the Bible could be conceived as the work of social engineers prioritized over the work of social scientists, even though its historical success was dependent on primitive social science. Even with the most sincere intentions to enlighten the public, I have low expectations for the prospect of mixing science and religion among most people. Can I be proved wrong? For these reasons, it is very likely that intellectuals who observe the popular consequences of mixing science and ancient religious traditions might conclude that the singularity is a religion without any scientific foundation. I can only suggest that people attempt to raise their own standards of intellectual inquiry. Only those who have separated the scientific issues from the practical social/religious issues in their own mind would be able to maintain clarity between the scientifically grounded basis of the singularity and its relationship to the monotheistic tradition. While Newton was a modern theist, a classic example of a pantheist is Einstein. I believe in Spinoza's God who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a God who concerns himself with fates and actions of human beings. 36 Yet when the traditional pantheistic belief in the laws of nature meets the law of accelerating returns, what we are confronted with is a rather noteworthy paradox. It turns out that the orderly continuation of the law of accelerating returns could potentially lead to a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings.